Today, we're going to talk about a theory of learning called classical conditioning. And classical conditioning is based on the work of Ivan Pavlov. So let's begin by discussing his work. So Pavlov became interested in the question, can reflexes be learned? So first, let's define what is meant by a reflex. A reflex is an automatic, involuntary response. One example is blinking. All throughout the day, we are blinking, and we do this automatically. We don't think about it. So that's an example of a reflex. Or another example of a reflex could be maybe you go to the doctor for a physical exam. And sometimes a doctor might take a medical hammer and tap your knee. And if they tap your knee in the right place, then your leg will automatically kick up. And so that's another example of a reflex. But Pavlov ended up studying the reflex of salivation. So salivation is also an example of a reflex. It's the first step in our digestion system. And, when you put food on your tongue, you automatically begin to salivate. So he decided to examine the specific reflex of salivation, and he used dogs in his famous experiments. Now, this is a picture which illustrates Pavlov's famous experiment with his dogs. So let's take a look at it. First, there is this stage called before conditioning. So what Pavlov would do is he would present some food to the dogs, and the dogs would, of course, salivate at the sight of the food. So at this point in the experiment, the food is called an unconditioned stimulus, and then the salivation is called an unconditioned response. Then he moved on. Oh, I'm sorry. And then also, before conditioning, he would ring a bell, and then there would be no response. So the bell is a neutral stimulus, and the dogs would not salivate at the sound of the bell because no conditioning has taken place. So the bell really has no meaning, and that's why the bell is called a neutral stimulus. All right, now we move to the conditioning phase, or if it's easier for you to think about it as a training phase, it's really the same thing. So during this phase, Pavlov would pair the sound of the bell with the presentation of the food, and of course the dog would salivate. So he would ring the bell and then simultaneously present the food, and the dog would salivate. And this phase he would do more than one time. And then the final phase is post-conditioning or after conditioning. And now Pavlov would ring the bell, but not present the food. And how do you think the dog would respond? Well, the dog would salivate at the sound of the bell, even though there's no food being presented. So what does that mean? Essentially, what has happened is that the dog has learned that the sound of the bell means dinner time. And so the dog has come to associate, that's really the key word here, associate or associations. The dog comes to associate the sound of the bell with food. Now, one thing I want to mention, because I know from experience that sometimes people get a little mixed up and they think that the food is a reward for the dog, but that's not what's happening here. That's a different type of learning that we'll get into later. What's happening is just that the bell means food. It's not a reward for the dog. It's just simply alerting the dog that it's time for his dinner. So this is called classical conditioning. Let's look at the same thing just presented in a slightly different way. So here it's broken down for us. We have the three phases: before conditioning, during conditioning, and after conditioning. So once again, before conditioning, Pavlov would ring the bell. The dog would have no response, no salivation. The bell is neutral because it has no meaning at this point, and then there's no response. Here is the conditioning phase, presenting the bell and the food at the same time or very close together at the same time, or it's called contiguously. So ring-a-ling-a-ling, here's the food, and of course the dog will salivate. Pavlov would do this phase more than once, and then we move to after conditioning, and now all Pavlov has to do is ring the bell and the dog salivates. And this is classical conditioning in a nutshell. Now we're going to talk about another very famous experiment from the field of psychology, from the history of psychology, and that's the work by John Watson. So now, whereas Pavlov was interested in studying whether or not reflexes can be learned, Watson wondered, can fear be learned? So what do you think? Do you think fear can be learned? So Watson used a baby, and his name was Little Albert, to explore this question. Here's how his classical experiment was broken down. He took a cute white rat and presented it to little Albert, and there was no response. So this is the preconditioning phase here. So at the start, this baby had no fear of rats. At the beginning, the rat is a neutral stimulus, just like the bell was a neutral stimulus in Pavlov's work. All right, then Watson took a hammer and banged it against some steel bars and made a very loud, unpleasant noise. What was little Albert's response? He was afraid and startled by this loud noise, and so he would cry. He had a fear response. This represents the conditioning phase now. So now Watson would present the cute rat to little Albert, and then at the same time make the loud, scary noise, and of course little Albert would cry. And just like Pavlov did the conditioning phase with the dogs more than once, Watson did the same thing with little Albert. And then now this last picture here represents post-conditioning or after conditioning. And what would Watson do? He would present the rat. He would not make the scary noise though. And how would little Albert respond? He would cry and act afraid of the rat. So what has happened here is that little Albert has learned to associate the rat with the loud, scary noise. So he sees the rat and he immediately thought, uh-oh, here comes the terrible noise. So yes, Watson proved that fears can indeed be learned. Now, one of the criticisms of this experiment that Watson conducted on this baby, first of all, it's considered unethical because he basically traumatized this baby. All right, so we would not do an experiment like this today. And then another criticism is that he did not use what's called counter conditioning to eliminate little Albert's fear of rats. Now, counter conditioning is defined as replacing an unpleasant stimulus with a pleasant stimulus to form positive associations during a training phase. So what Watson could have done, and really he should have done, is he could have done the same experiment, but instead of having a loud, scary noise when he presented the rat, he could have presented a pleasant stimulus, like maybe he could have played little Albert's favorite song, or he could have brought out little Albert's favorite book every time he presented the rat. And then in that way, little Albert would form new associations, and then he would think, oh, the rat means my favorite song is coming. And in that way, his fear of rats could have been eliminated. But Watson did not do this, and so that's another criticism of this experiment. And I'm going to end it here, and then we'll be exploring some other topics related to learning in some future videos.